Welcome to this webinar with Abundance and Climate Emergency UK. Without any further ado, I suggest, Danny, let's get on with it. So, hi, my name's Matt Reeves from Abundance Investment. We're here today to talk about councils and climate action, and we, Abundance, are interested in this because we offer investments with councils, council green investments that let councils engage with residents and members of the public to fund their climate action. And I'm delighted that today we've been joined by Annie, who knows an awful lot about this subject, and is going to share some of that knowledge with us today. So, Annie.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Annie, and I'm the Operations Director at Climate Emergency UK. We're the organisation behind the Council Climate Action Scorecards, which I'll cover in a little bit of detail later on. But we, in a nutshell, measure all local authorities in the UK on their climate action, like 7 sections, 90 questions, and publish that and do a lot of training and support alongside to support both residents and councils to get further and faster local climate action. So I'm going to be talking for quite a bit of the session, but there's definitely going to be space for questions towards the end. I think we're going to take questions at the end. So if you feel like I haven't answered them, hopefully I answer them throughout, or we'll get them all at the end. The session is being recorded, but I don't think that makes much difference to you guys because it's a webinar function. So I'll get going.
And just before you start, Annie, I'll just let, from an admin perspective, if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature. That's the best way, just to make sure it doesn't get lost in the chat. So head to the Q&A feature in Zoom, put your question in there. If you see a question that someone else has already asked, you can upvote that question to make sure that we get that answered at the end. But as Annie mentioned, we'll save up your questions and we'll deal with it at the end. If you've got any other queries as we go through, you can use the chat. I'll be monitoring that chat and I can answer questions as Annie is going. So without any further ado, over to you, Annie.
Thank you. So today the aims of this session is to kind of cover the basics of how a UK council functions, and it really is the basics. Like, they can be quite complicated and complex, and we don't have that long, so it's kind of a rushed overview to some extent. I'm going to cover a little bit about what powers councils have in terms of what they can do for climate action. Try and understand briefly how councils are delivering on climate action and a little bit on what best practice looks like. And then kind of both from myself and Matt at the end, covering a little bit about how you might want to be able to support your council as they're part of your local community to take climate action. So we're starting with why councils. And I think this slide really beautifully shows the power and influence that councils have. So these, I should know where this is and I don't. I think it might be somewhere in Paris. In the past, in the present, and in the future. And you can see that, back then there was coach and horses, there was lots of shop fronts, maybe not so many people around, big tall buildings. Present day, there's cars on the road, there's street lighting, the shops are a bit further back. And maybe the future might look different. There might be further trees, there might be cycle lanes, there might be fewer cars on the road. And I just think it's really useful to think about this in terms of what our environment looks like determines what actions we might take. So if there is a road available, you're more likely to take your car. If there is, a footpath, you're more likely to walk. You're more likely to access the shops if they are easy to get to, like from your mode of transport, or near where you live. And councils, and we'll come to it, have a lot of influence over a lot of these things and influencing our local environment. And that can have a huge impact on our behaviour. And I guess here we're looking at specifically in terms of our behaviour and what that means in terms of carbon emissions and climate reduction. So I kind of covered it a bit briefly there. What percentage of emissions do you think are within the scope and or influence of councils? And I've got 3 numbers here. So have a moment to think in your head which one it might be. Some of you might know some of this stuff, so this might be easy to you. But the answer is potentially either up to 1/3 or up to 82%, depending on who you listen from. So in the Climate Change Committee's report a few years ago, they determined that local authorities have power influence over roughly 1/3 of emissions in the local area. But a few years later, the UK government net zero strategy says there's 82% of emissions are within the scope of influence of local authorities. And I think it's important to recognise that it is scope. We're not suggesting they have direct control, but they definitely have influence over a lot of things within a local area. So whether it's 32 or 82, I don't really mind. Basically, it's quite a lot of influence, and that's kind of why we're talking about councils in relation to climate today. And I touched upon it really briefly. I'm sorry if this is a little bit too small. But in terms of spheres of influence, obviously councils directly control their buildings, their leisure centres, you know, their own house, as it were. But they have spheres of influence over lots of other things. So they have influence over the types of new buildings that are built in the area, where your roads might be going. Whilst they don't have like direct control over everything that happens in schools or local businesses, you know, their licensing schemes, you know, their pedestrianising of various streets will influence those local businesses, those schools. So there's definitely like lots of levels of influence. And one that often you hear councils talk about is about their role of kind of convening. They're often a trusted voice within a local community, and because they in effect have fingers in lots of pies, they're often quite good at being able to get those different groups to come together, perhaps not necessarily to do all the work, but at least to start that conversation and get some of those people working together. So what is a council? You might think this is a bit of a silly question, but I just want to let you know that lots of people aren't really sure what a council is. This is taken from the West Midlands Combined Authority website, which I kind of find quite amusing. It says clearly on their website, we are not a council. You don't pay your council tax to us, and we don't collect your bins. Your local authority does. And I do just think that it shows it's quite normal to be confused about what we mean when we say council, or what local government is, or a local authority, because, you know, people coming to the West Midlands Combined Authority website are confused and they feel they need to say really clearly. And I won't dwell too much on what combined authorities are, but yeah, they're not quite councils. They're the highest tier of local government that only exist in England. So briefly, I kind of touched on what are the tiers of local government. And they've all got slightly different names. We're not discussing town and parish councils today. They're kind of at the very bottom. And then you have councils. So that is your district, it's your unitaries, it's your single tiers. They might also be called a county council, your metropolitan boroughs, and it's also all local authorities in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Your combined authorities, as well as the Greater London Authority, so that's those that have directly elected mayors, are at a regional level. Then obviously you've got the national government in the nations, and the UK Parliament that we already know. Very briefly, if you're kind of interested in local government, there is a bit of a trend to going to unitary authority. So rather than having two tiers of government where you have district council and county council within one area, there's a bit of a trend to having one kind of big mega council, which will have all the powers of both those councils and cover a wider area. You might have heard some of that. Labour are big on devolution, which might lead to more things like this and or more combined authorities. This is a very brief summary of what local government systems look like in the nations. Now, the reason I've put in there very briefly about when their next local elections are, their voting age and their electoral system is because, maybe this is a bit obvious, when you can go and vote and when councils have their next local elections is one way you can influence who runs the council and perhaps what work they might be doing on climate or everything else. But I think it's important to note that those elections don't happen every year. I think it's every 4 to 5 years in some of the nations. It's every 4 years in county councils, and it varies across England in different ways. So we're just waiting around till elections to influence our councils. That's probably not, you know, the most effective way to be doing it. So kind of that's why that's there to think about how else might we work with councils, and I'll come to that later. So we've covered what councils are. This is now, what do councils do? In short, a lot. So councils have different powers, over 13,000 different statutory duties, is what the Local Government Association say. Some might say more, some might say less. And that's on a lot of things you probably recognise. So collecting your bins, the schools, the libraries. They also run the general elections and other things like that. And here it just shows how those powers are split between district and county councils. If you live somewhere where there is just one level of local government, so I'm in Brighton and Hove and we have a unitary Brighton and Hove Council, Brighton and Hove Council has both of those lists combined. There is also a lot that councils do that isn't statutory, and I'm not sure I explained what statutory is. Statutory is another word for legal, so they have a legal obligation to provide those services. And it often means they get funding alongside it, but that's a little bit questionable. We'll come to funding later. So there's a lot of other things that councils do, where you park your car, the swimming pools they provide. Sometimes they provide grants to voluntary organisations. And the one in bold is at the bottom, climate action. So yes, some councils have limited statutory duty on a couple of climate-related things. So air quality they have to monitor and look at in some ways, and taking preventative action against it. But in general, kind of their desire and ambition to deliver net zero and cut carbon and make communities healthier and safer, that isn't a statutory duty for local government in England and Northern Ireland. Wales and Scotland have some powers to that, but not entirely, and I'll come to that in a bit. This, I don't expect you to understand, but I just think, again, it's really useful to reassure you, to kind of explain, like, it is confusing exactly what councils do and who has the power. So this is from the Institute for Government, and they have tried to make it nice and clear exactly what powers different types of local authorities have. And the boxes show whether they have the power, or some of those types of councils have it, but not all. Like I said, you don't need to read this in detail, but just to remind you that it is complicated. And I think even if you feel confident about knowing how your local area works, there's no guarantee the structures are the same. There's some similarities, but they may well be just a little bit different elsewhere. So in terms of what councils can do for climate, I'm going to be a bit lazy here and just show you a big slide of lots of images. So all of these images actually come from the Friends of the Earth's case studies. So a few years ago, they compiled a list of 50 actions that councils can do in order to take action on the climate. And most of those actions we also cover in those action scorecards that we create. And I'll just kind of describe some of these pictures here, but hopefully you kind of work it out for yourself. What can councils do for climate? So they can, the top left-hand corner, they can determine the requirements for renewable energy that is put on new buildings, but they can also support residents to collectively buy renewable energy at a reduced cost and get some economies of scale going. They can help with planning. So where are new homes built, or new buildings, or new roads? How do they connect to each other? We touched on before about pollution. So they have some role in passing whether there is a clean air zone in a particular area, or whether there's a school streets next to a school where you stop the cars running at certain times of the day. Councils also have some influence over the food we eat. So with contracts with schools that are providing school meals, whether that food provided in those meals are vegetarian or locally sourced, or kind of more sustainable. Big picture of a lot of vans. I'm kind of working through this picture. Councils can both help with the implementation of electrical vehicle charging points in their local area for residents to use, but they can also turn their own fleet into renewable or electric cars that they're using. And their next picture, I guess, can be two things here. It's both about whether their waste collection vehicles are low carbon, but also about whether they're supporting residents to recycle. So what can you recycle, and when can you recycle it? Can you recycle Tetra Packs? Can you not? Do you provide curbside food waste recycling? I always get that round the wrong way. we touched on this earlier, but yeah, cycle lanes or tree planting, they have a huge influence over where those are built and how they're used. And finally, on transport, so they can have some influence, although not as much, on the bus routes and perhaps trains, maybe more with the nationalisation. So that's one slide, but that's covering quite a lot of things. And I think it's kind of fair to say that, yeah, councils do have a lot of influence over a lot of different things. So in terms of how do we know whether councils are doing these or what they're doing, in our Council Climate Action Scorecards, we measure councils on up to 93 actions across 7 sections. So a lot of what we cover were in those pictures above, but it's also a lot of other things. So what I've listed there is the 7 sections we cover, and I've given you an example of what it looks like for Westminster, which were the highest scoring council. So we split out the score both by section and individual one. And I think maybe it's worth just touching on the collaboration engagement section here. So that's not necessarily about specific actions that councils are doing that have tangible impact on reducing emissions, but that's more about how are they working with others, whether that's schools, residents, local businesses across the community, to ensure that decarbonisation can happen effectively and with residents' involvement. No one likes being told exactly what to do without kind of an understanding of why and where's that come from. So yeah, I will share in the chat now if I can, perhaps. There's not the link to our scorecards, and I'd really encourage you to have a look at your own council score and see where they score and what you think of that. Of course, a lot of this work that councils do require some money. And as Matt said at the beginning, they work with councils to raise funds and get investments for local government. So I'm just going to pass to Matt now to briefly explain a little bit about what Abundance do.
Yes, so as Annie mentioned, we at Abundance work with councils to raise funds through our council green investments. And I'll just mention a few things that councils have used money for over the years. We've raised about £11 million so far for 13 different councils. And to give a bit of a flavour of the types of things they do, we've had quite a lot of councils using these investments to fund green energy type measures. So the very first council we worked with, West Berkshire Council, they were funding rooftop solar on community buildings around their district to reduce the carbon impact of their own buildings and built environment, something that's obviously very much in their control. But actually quite a lot of councils are also raising money for activities that are trying to promote climate action in the wider community. So Lewisham would be an example of that. They were funding cycle facilities, cycle hangars and secure cycle storage to enable more people in their community to utilise active transport. So that's another common use of funds. Another area that's increasingly coming into focus is promotion of biodiversity. So Oxfordshire Council, who are raising money with us just at the moment, part of their funds are being used to fund their county-wide tree planting scheme. So that is another area where councils are increasingly focused. And the last example I would draw your attention to is literally supporting community organisations. So Telford raised money with us back in 2022, and part of their funds were used to support their Climate Action Fund, which is supporting local businesses who wanted to put green measures into their own businesses to decarbonise their operations. So there's a whole different scope, there's a whole different range of options that councils have, and the councils who work with us have utilised a lot of those different mechanisms in the money they've raised so far.
So we've kind of covered what councils can do, and I guess the next question that follows from that is, how do we know what councils are doing for the climate? Are they doing this work, and are they doing it well? So it would be great if there was some sort of national framework, I would say, where councils were assessed, or at least, to find out what they're up to. But we don't yet have that, and I touched upon that a little bit earlier. So there is no national reporting framework for local government to kind of show and understand what they're doing for climate, despite Parliament and I guess the UK government setting a net zero 2050 target. So there isn't the kind of step down targets and assessments there. Having said that, in Scotland, it is a little bit different. So all Scottish local authorities do have to provide annual reports on what they're doing in relation to their carbon reductions. And they've been doing it since 2015-16, and they're all publicly available online. They all follow the same format. It's the same spreadsheet and the same questions. So it's much easier to get some understanding of what councils are doing in Scotland in terms of climate action, and that might be something you want to look into more. In Wales, they have set at a Welsh government level, they want the public sector to be net zero by 2050. So that includes councils. So that kind of doesn't cover the area-wide operations that councils are doing, but it does include what councils are doing in terms of their own buildings and their own understanding. So this is just to show there are some reporting mechanisms in some areas of the UK, but in Northern Ireland and in England, there currently isn't that framework. And that is one of the big reasons why we do the scorecards, because it's all well and good seeing individual case studies of councils doing something good, but it's hard to understand when there's almost 400 councils in the UK. Like, is everyone doing this great piece of work, or is it only one council doing this, or only 10? And if so, why is that the case? There are a couple of other ways that people report on their climate action. There is the Carbon Disclosure Project, and we wrote a blog with them, and this is kind of the screenshot of it a few months ago. So this is an international initiative, and about under 100 UK councils take part of it. So they're kind of choosing to get involved, and it assesses how councils are working towards net zero. But what I would say with it is the assessment that the Carbon Disclosure Project do is quite broad and potentially, I don't quite want to say like a lower bar, and that's simply because it's at an international level. So they're working with local communities where the national government don't even have a 2050 net zero target, haven't thought really that much about maybe some climate things that we have or maybe other countries have looked at. So it's kind of a catch-all in order to kind of fit with the variety of where councils and organizations are across the world. But yeah, if you want to find out more, we've got quite a good blog on the kind of differences and the use of how both of those are useful together in terms of our scorecards and the carbon disclosure work that they do. And in terms of how it looks for councils themselves, this is an example of how councils are reporting on their missions. So without this national framework, councils are generally all reporting on their emissions, but the quality and the depth and the way they present on it is really quite varied. So there's two examples here. That first one I think is from Lancaster, and it's a Power BI kind of live dashboard with loads of information in terms of their carbon over multiple years, looking at different areas of the council. So really quite varied. I can't remember which one this other council is from. I think that actually might be Kent County Council. But it's a little bit simpler, perhaps. I can't even necessarily work out those actual numbers. Somewhere between 98 and 100, I guess 99. Their emissions on the bottom one is maybe somewhere above 10,000, but harder to see. And the reason I show that, just to show that it's really hard to measure exactly what councils are doing, especially in relation to direct carbon reduction, when how they're choosing to measure it is different. So that's, again, one of the reasons we have the scorecards, to try and give some standardization and guidance to how councils could be measuring in order for it to be a little bit easier to compare. And I think the important reason why we want to compare is so that we can learn from different councils and from different communities on what they're doing and how to do it best. And now we're going to cover briefly, where does the money come from for councils and climate action? And I think this is important because, as we so often know in this world, the question falls back to, like, how is this work funded, or who is paying for this work, especially when some of this work isn't necessarily a legal duty for councils, although given the kind of wave of climate emergency declarations and the back in 2019, 2020 and the enthusiasm from local communities, I think you'd probably agree with me that there's definitely like that will for it to happen in a lot of areas, but maybe the funding is not always possible. I'm going to cover very briefly how councils are funded, and Matt is going to explain in a little bit more detail how it all works, because again, it's not the easiest. So councils get their money from government grants, some council tax, business rates, and any income they generate, and they also have their reserves. In the devolved nations, it's a little bit different because their money comes from Parliament and then from the Scottish Government. But there's a few ways that they are getting funds of varying levels. I think this is an important slide to share, that since 2010, the spending in real terms for most councils, sorry, Northern Ireland isn't on this list, has gone down quite a bit. So it's up to 20% less in 2018, 2019. To be honest, I should have an even more recent slide. I can tell you that number hasn't gone up. If anything, it's gone down in real terms. Scotland and Wales have also had similar issues, but I guess not as extreme. So I've kind of just put that there to give you a bit of idea of kind of, yeah, what their spending might be looking like in terms of real terms. But Matt is going to cover a little bit more about, yeah, how the finances of councils work, perhaps. And yeah, how they, yeah, I'll leave you to explain, Matt.
Thanks, Annie. An easy one. Yes, so at a very high level, I think it's important to kind of realise, because there's always an awful lot of narratives in the media and about councils and their cash flows and being short of money and all this type of thing. I think what's important to recognise is there is a difference between councils' day-to-day spending on those core services that Annie mentioned further up in the list, and their investments that they make in the longer term future of their communities. So just like you or I, a council has day-to-day obligations, and they also have a requirement to invest in the future. Same way that you and I might buy a house or so on by taking a mortgage. In a similar way, the council has to make long-term investments in the future of their communities, and an awful lot of the climate action work falls into this category. And the councils do borrow money. They borrow money from an organisation called the Public Works Loan Board, which is a central government linked organisation, and that is the primary source of the majority of their long-term finance that they raise for these type of investments. So I think it's a very complicated area, but I think what is clear is that we have day-to-day pressures on council spending, and we have the requirement or the desire that councils have to invest in the future of their communities. And councils borrow billions and billions of pounds every year from the Public Works Loan Board to invest into long-term projects, and they do that in the same way that you and I might do when we take out a mortgage. You know, they have their income which they can use to fund their kind of day-to-day activities, and they have the long-term financial position that they are in, and all of these things are very tightly regulated. So I think for now it's just really essential to kind of appreciate that there is a difference between those two things: the day-to-day spending of councils on core activities and the long-term investment that they make into their communities.
Thank you. And I'm sure we can take further questions at the end if people want to dive into that in a little bit more detail. So moving on, what can we do for council climate action? So, you know, as residents, hopefully you all live in the UK, so this is relevant to you. We all have some power and influence over our councils. And like I said before, perhaps more than just voting every 2, 4 or 5 years, there's other ways that we can work with councils to deliver some of that climate action that we want to have. I kind of jumped ahead and touched on it a little bit earlier here, but yeah, hopefully some of you remember those climate emergency declarations that started popping up around 2019. That map shows within the UK and Ireland all the places that have declared climate emergency declarations, and it's up to over 80% now. Bristol was the first, and following that there's been lots of other councils. And I think the reason we kind of come back to this so much is that this was spearheaded by residents. This wasn't a like political party or a council idea necessarily. It was really from residents, and councils got on board with it, and we really saw kind of that multiplier effect of being like, oh God, well, if like Worthing have done it, then maybe like the other council, Dorset, should also do it. So most councils declared climate emergencies, passed a motion saying they wanted to be net zero by 2030, 2050 or something similar. And from that, some of them wrote climate action plans. But this is where it starts to kind of become less clear. Like you've got the kind of commitment, you have a plan, but are you necessarily doing that work? So some of you might have been aware when the councils were like creating these plans, they might have had citizens' assemblies or kind of consultations for ways for you to kind of influence those climate action plans. So that's one way that you can get involved in that kind of, like public ways to engage with the council. And from our scorecards, I just want to cover a little bit more about kind of other ways that councils can engage with their climate. So we found that 63% of councils, this is from our scorecards that were published in October 2023, have published an annual climate action update report. So this is really important for transparency so that residents can find out what the council are doing on this issue that they care about, rather than it just being something brushed under the carpet. We also found that 53% of councils, sorry for there's no gap there, have an ongoing way for residents to influence the implementation of the council's climate action plan. So that varies quite a lot, but that might be some sort of citizens' assembly or been and gone. They might have some sort of roundtable discussion. They might have a working group that includes representatives from different parts of the community. But we do think it's really important that the plan isn't just delivered by the council alone and that other residents are involved in kind of shaping the implementation. So that might be something to think about how you can get involved with your council there. Maybe this is the final confusing slide that I share with you. And again, councils are confusing. That's why that's here. But all of these blue boxes basically are moments when residents can be part of those council decision-making processes in some ways. So when a councillor brings a motion to declare a climate emergency, like I said before, often that came from residents. You could get them to bring motions on other things. You can attend full councils meetings. You can also ask questions at full council. You can even submit petitions. So you can be engaged in kind of what they are discussing. Often residents can also attend the relevant committees and kind of one-to-one conversations with those councillors to understand what is happening there. And then if we jump to that kind of the end, following that flow chart, when those policies are enacted, hopefully they've got ways that residents can be engaged with that process whilst it was happening. And kind of we think back to some of the earlier slides, a lot of the powers and influence that councils have is about their kind of sphere of influence and about working with others to achieve these. So, they can't just approve shiny bits of paper day in, day out. They need delivery to happen, and that can't just happen from councils alone. So it's really important to see how councils are working with others on that. And just finally, I think kind of this is kind of implicit throughout in what we've been saying. A lot of kind of whether councils take climate action, yes, it is partly to do with the funds they have available, but it's down to lots of different factors, and that does include like the political will, the kind of understanding and the interest both from the councillors and the officers and the residents. So I think that's always really important to bear in mind, and I think the variety of results in our scorecards really shows that. Like, so many councils have similar-ish financial positions, and maybe they're like from the same political party, maybe they're like geographically near each other, but the action scorecards results are quite different, and that might be down to some of that kind of ambition. So we're coming to the end of our like formal bit of conversation. I'm just kind of briefly cover how you might immediately want to get involved with us. So please do use the scorecards. Look at what your council has scored. We've got a bit of guidance on our website in terms of which actions you might want to prioritize encouraging your council to work with, that kind of like achievable and not too expensive. We also run training sessions, and we can do that with like a community group or with an organisation you're part of. So if you would like us to tell you a bit more about what the scorecards show for your council or a local area, we'd be happy to do that. And then just to say, the next scorecards are coming out in summer 2025. So like get that date in your diary and be ready to look at those when they come out. And yeah, we've got guidance on how you might want to engage with your council a little bit based on the scorecards. And maybe it's worth just saying here, in case you've never heard of the scorecards before, 22% of UK councils that we know of are already using the scorecards. That's over 1 in 5. So hopefully if you talk to your council about them, they'll have some understanding of what we're doing, and it's not a kind of random fringe event. And yeah, we're doing the second stage of a marking process at the moment, and we've had over 70% of councils engage with that. So it's hopefully well known within the sector. But I'll just pass to Matt to wrap up on abundance.
Yeah, so I mean, from our side, it's very simple. Our kind of engagement with the sector is very much on trying to encourage as many councils as possible to use green investments. We think they're an excellent way of them engaging both their residents and the broader public with what they're doing. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is that being out there and raising money in this way adds to the accountability and adds to their focus on their delivery. It's always pleasing for us when councils come to us and say, we want to use these investments because we want to get the message out there, we want to let people know what we're doing, we want to enable people to become involved and share the benefits, I suppose, of doing that. So from our perspective, ask your council. If you're in an area that's issued an investment already, ask them when they're going to do the next one. And if they haven't done a green investment before, maybe that's something to mention to them through those democratic processes, because we believe, and we always have done at Abundance, that enabling people to use their money locally to build something good for the future and build a greener future for the place they live, that's a really powerful message, and it's a really powerful way of driving change. So from our perspective, talk to your council, see if they're up for it.
Thank you. And I think that brings us to the end. So we've got some space for questions, but in case people are rushing off, I will just let them know what's already happening. So we've got the local Climate Academy, which is a free 6-week online training course to equip you with the skills and knowledge to support your council to tackle the climate and ecological crises. The one in January is already fully booked. So check out our website to get involved with the future ones. I think, Matt, maybe you mentioned it earlier, or at least we spoke about earlier this week. Oxfordshire County Council have now opened their investment programme. So check that out. Yeah. And that was only yesterday?
Yeah, that was on Monday. They opened their first investment, and they're the first county council, super niche claim, but there you go. They are the first county council to use a green investment with us. So that's very cool. And as I mentioned, I think earlier on in this session, they're using the money raised to decarbonize some of their own buildings that they already own, and also to fund their tree building, strange phrase, tree planting. Don't build trees, do you? Tree planting program around the county. So that's very cool. Okay, great. Thank you, Annie. So we have got some questions that have come in. So a couple of them are abundancy type ones. So I will answer those in a minute. But first of all, a question for you, Annie. It's early days, obviously, for the new government, but have you seen any changes or signs of change in terms of central government support for councils in terms of delivering net zero and green priorities?
Good question. I would say maybe not quite yet, but I think a lot of it is in the pipeline. So we've got the future home standards, which are being reviewed, and I think the kind of updates are due to come out in the new year. And that really will make quite a difference in terms of the planning requirements for local authorities, in terms of what requirements are needed for new builds, and whether we are kind of working more towards higher levels of energy efficiency, renewable energy production, and things like that. The effective ban that we had on onshore wind power was obviously not great for local authorities who wanted to have kind of community-owned renewable energy, or even just renewable energy locally. So that change, I think, will start to trickle down, and we'll, hopefully might see some more renewable energy projects linked from there. So there are, I would say, I think we will see some differences, but I don't think they've quite yet come into play yet. I touched upon earlier about the kind of talks about devolution and kind of perhaps having more metro mayors. That might be a good thing for the climate. It might not be. And the Blueprint Coalition, of which we're a member of, have been doing some work on that as well. So I think maybe ask me this in 6 months' time, and I think we might start to see some impacts. But I think for now, they're kind of doing their national stuff, and that will start to have an impact at a local level.
Great, thank you, Annie. Okay, there's a couple of abundancy type questions which I'll take now, and then I'll switch back for your opinion on something else, Annie. So, Lee Barker, you've asked a couple of questions. I will answer the question you asked me second first, perversely, because it will help me answer the first one. So you asked about how the rates are set, so how the interest rate on a council green investment or community municipal investment is set. Short answer is it's set based on the Public Works Loan Board prevailing rate at the time that it is issued. So I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but councils can and do borrow money from the Public Works Loan Board. That is a cost-effective way for them to borrow money, and it reflects their extremely low, indeed almost negligible risk of default. So councils cannot statutorily default on their debts like a company can, in order to escape paying that debt back or paying the interest that's owed on that debt. So essentially, a council borrowing money is pegged at being only slightly more risky than investing in the UK government. So the Public Works Loan Board borrowing rate is ever so slightly higher than the government gilt rate at a given point in time, and that's give or take how it is set. So at the point the council wants to raise money and their loan is going to launch, we will check the Public Works Loan Board rate at that time, and we'll have a conversation with the council to ensure that the rate that they will pay on their borrowing does not exceed that Public Works Loan Board rate, because the council has an obligation, of course, to have best value for money for council taxpayers and to borrow money in the most efficient way that it can. So essentially, from a council's point of view, when they issue a municipal investment, it won't cost them more in terms of the borrowing than it would do if they had gone to the Public Works Loan Board. The way that works out for the customer is, well, I mean, as of right now, the Oxfordshire investment that I mentioned is paying 4.4% interest a year. So it typically works out that the rate that the customer, the investor, will receive is there or thereabouts the kind of among the kind of top rates that you would get on a fixed rate kind of savings product at the point in time that the investment is issued, which is in keeping with the low risk nature of the investment. So that's how the rates are set. And that then follows on to the other question that Lee asked, which was about, can climate bonds or community municipal investments be used by a council to fund community energy group projects, such as installing solar PV on community buildings? Now, the short answer to that is yes, in theory, that can happen. And the reason that might be a positive thing to do is because of that borrowing cost that I mentioned. So a council borrowing money through a mechanism like this, or indeed from the Public Works Loan Board, is going to be an efficient way of borrowing capital at a relatively low cost compared to the capital that might be able to be attracted in other ways. And there have been examples in the past of councils who have borrowed money and used that money to support community groups who wanted to do particular green actions in their places. We have not seen that specifically through a CMI that we have issued ourselves so far, but yes, that is technically possible, and that is something that could be done in the future. A good question for you, Annie, perhaps, that's come in from Raisha, is that climate action, we've already mentioned this, is a non-statutory service. So how can residents push councils to take more meaningful action? What levers are there to nudge them and hold them accountable, or indeed to recognise where they're not having the progress that they said they would? How can residents do something about it if it's not something that is statutory?
Yeah, so I'll answer your question, and then I'll also talk a little about whether maybe it should be a statutory duty, because that's one way to think about it. So, you know, that's one of the reasons we do the scorecards, to hold councils accountable. I think we all have most councils have declared a climate emergency, and they've passed a motion saying they will do those things. So it's really important that we hold them to account, that they then deliver on those things. And that's why we do the scorecard, so that we can see whether they are doing those things and where they could improve. So there's classic ways of applying public pressure that you might want to think about in terms of engaging with your council, engaging with community groups to kind of talk to them on that. But I also think it's important to think a little bit more holistically. There might be specific projects that you want the council to work on, whether it's a school streets area or whether it's particularly on kind of, circular economy, library of things, or something like that. And often a lot of these things have a lot of co-benefits. So councils are there to kind of make their communities safer and better, both for the climate and everything else. So councils might kind of be in favor of doing projects that, in terms of health things, if you're like encouraging people to walk and cycle places, that's got loads of health benefits, which might reduce the amount of social care or other things that they're having to deal with. In terms of, what did I just talk about just then? It's totally gone from my head. There's a lot of co-benefits to what they can do, and it often can save money both for the council and the residents. So I think the buildings and heatings is a really good one. We are one of the worst insulated countries in Europe, and our rates of retrofit are going. They could be better, but there's so many benefits for that. You've got like healthier homes for residents, cheaper bills for residents, and that means they're less likely to be in insecure housing, then wanting to go on the council housing list, then wanting to kind of get that additional support. So I think when kind of persuading your council what actions can take, I think it's important to think about some of those co-benefits, but also think about what is it that your council or your councillors care about. What are their passion projects? What are their opinions on different aspects of the local community? And I didn't cover in the slides, but councillors don't get paid a lot to do this. In fact, almost nothing. They're often doing this role alongside other jobs, other work. And most people, I would say, who are councillors, do it because they care about their local community. So really tapping into, why is it they care about their community? What is it they want to see change? And how might that have some climate benefits? To kind of answer the next bit of the question is like, how can we get councils to do more? We think it would be quite good if there was a fully funded statutory duty for climate for local government. It would give them just that little bit more impetus in order to deliver this work and some corresponding funding. So alongside our scorecards, we've been working with others at a national level to do a little bit of that advocacy for that. And you might or might not have seen the Lord Krebs recently introduced a backbench bill, which was requiring public bodies to have a statutory duty pretty much on climate, and kind of embed those environmental targets from the 2008 Climate Act into public bodies' work. So that would include local government. So we worked with the Wildlife and Countryside Link and were part of that briefing. And Lord Krebs and some other peers did mention the scorecards in the House of Lords, which was quite exciting. So there is some work happening there. And I think there might be some drive from some councils to start passing motions to call for a statutory duty for climate and get it funded from local government. So that's a kind of another way that you might be interested. If that starts happening, maybe you want to get your council to also pass those motions to try and influence things at a national level.
Thank you, Annie. That's great. So I have two questions that are sort of about a similar thing, so I'm going to group the answering of them together. So Andy has asked, how do abundance, or has abundance any influence on how the money gets spent by councils who raise money in this way? And Vaughan has asked similarly, does abundance give preference to requests from councils that are really committing to doing the right things and doing it right? So I'll answer those two questions together. The short answer is, when a council issues an investment to us, they go through what's known as a green loan compliance process. So the green loan principles are an internationally recognized set of standards for green investments that are used by the UK government also when they issue their green gilt program. And what that essentially means is that the council has to produce and sign up to a green finance framework document, which outlines the things that they can use the money that they raise on abundance for, and it is restricted to only green activities. So from the perspective of having influence on how the money is being spent, councils, when they raise money with us, they will indicate what they intend to use the money for, and we monitor throughout the investment term through regular reporting what they are spending the money on, and we report that back to investors. I'll share a link in the chat to our page on our site that talks about that. So essentially, in terms of influence, if a council didn't use the money for the purpose they said they were going to do, and that became apparent through monitoring, then we wouldn't be in a position to issue another green loan compliant investment with that council. So that, I suppose, is the kind of governance framework, if you want to talk about that. In terms of giving preference to requests from councils that are committed to doing the right things, we only work with councils who have got defined net zero plans, which is obviously one of the things that the climate emergency scorecards are looking at. And essentially, the reason that a lot of councils want to use these investments is they welcome, certainly the climate emergency and the climate action teams are welcoming the focus and the accountability that it brings when they issue an investment in this way. When you've gone out publicly and said you're going to raise money for climate action, and you've said what you're going to do with the money that you've raised, and you have a community of investors who have decided to back you in what you're doing, that adds a tremendous layer of accountability into that process, because you've got an engaged group of stakeholders, an engaged group of people who really are invested, literally in this case, in what it is that you are doing and in the plans that you've got. And I think that's an incredibly important element of what a kind of CMI or a council green investment can deliver, because it does deliver that accountability. It does deliver that oversight from you and I and other investors out there who have backed their plans. So from our perspective, that's really the power that the council green investment can have.
And if I can just add and kind of answer a bit of the question backwards, in the scorecards, we have a whole section on governance and finance, and we have 3 questions on how councils are raising funds for climate action. And one of them is, have they issued a community investment, a climate bond, community municipal investment, all similar? So if they have done one with abundance, that would get a mark. If others exist, that could also get a mark. So we are also looking at that as well, because we recognise that's one of the good ways in which councils can raise funds for climate action.
Cool, thank you, Annie. And a final question then for us to address from Andy. Should councils be prioritising things that have a quick effect on cutting CO2? So things like heat pumps, solar panels, battery stuff, over longer term projects like planting trees. I'll get your opinion on this, Annie, as well. But from an abundance point of view, the councils that we are working with have a broad strategy. So all the councils we're working with have goals to get to net zero or equivalent ahead of the government's target. I think I'm right in saying that all the councils we work with have that goal. And that obviously includes a mix of activities. So some of those activities are those shorter term priorities, and some of those activities are longer term things. So I don't think it's either or. I don't think you do one and don't do the other. I think you have to do both. And I think it's also worth observing that some of those shorter term actions have been the beneficiaries of grant funding. So Annie mentioned this in the kind of council funding section, and post-COVID there have been central government programs to support certain short-term actions, and obviously some councils have availed of that grant funding and can take those things forward. I think the benefit of a council investment or a council green investment is you can fund a variety of things. So not just the things that are going to benefit carbon cutting today, but the things that are going to build sustainable communities long term. I'm drawn to the example of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, who have invested a lot in sustainable urban drainage schemes, and that is obviously tremendously important for them as an urban council. They need to think about how the city is going to function in 50, 60 years and what is going to be needed for residents to live a comfortable life at that time. And I think it would be wrong personally for them to not do that and to put all of their focus therefore into things that can be delivered now. So my answer would be a mix of things are needed. I don't know what you would say, Annie.
Yeah, similar. I think what I would say is, yes, we want councils to be cutting carbon and adapting to the changing climate as fast and as quickly as possible. I also think, and you'll hear it from councils, every council is unique. Whilst there are some similarities, there are different situations in different areas. And I think it's important that councils focus on what is a priority for them in their area. So maybe, you know, privately rented homes, there's loads of them, and that's, you know, really poorly insulated, and that's the priority. Or maybe it's, yeah, they're a big rural place, and actually it's like transport is the big issue. I think, yeah, people need to focus on what matters to them locally, but also what is most possible locally. So I think, you know, some communities are more open to maybe tree planting everyone likes, but, you know, clean air zones or low traffic neighborhoods. But if that's going to be really difficult to get kind of community buy-in in your area, you know, don't start with the hardest thing. Start with something that is kind of a little bit more palatable and possible in that area. On our scorecards website, we've got a list of like 15 actions that we think councils should be prioritizing in terms of their climate action. And a lot of those are kind of smaller things. They're about kind of getting their kind of house in order and good governance, because once they start doing that, then it starts feeding into all of their decisions that they're making, rather than it being kind of these standalone shiny projects that councils are doing. So I think it varies on exactly what councils want to be doing. But yeah, like what is possible, like where is the energy, and focus on that to start with.
Very good. And I don't think there could be a better way for us to finish up our webinar. So that's all the questions answered. And I think energizing is the theme, isn't it? Energizing and accountability. There is a lot to do, and there are a lot of challenges ahead, but by doing things that hold councils to account and doing things that can energize the people who work for councils to feel like their work is making a difference, is really key. So from my perspective in Abundance, thank you very much for spending an hour with us today. It's been great. We will be in touch after the session, once the session has been recorded. So once I have fixed up those slightly dodgy slides in the first part, which you reported to us, I will share the recording with you guys so you can have a watch through at your leisure. But all it remains is for me to say thanks very much to Annie for that great presentation, super interesting, and thank you all very much for joining us.